Thank you, Kathy, very, very much. And it's always great to be in America. I spent a year as an exchange student in Connecticut, so coming back and checking if the TV soap operas have changed is always interesting. Days of Our Lives, General Hospital. I never did much high school. I studied high school. I graduated from an American high school. But I can tell you more about Days of Our Lives. In fact, I just want to give you another anecdote. When I landed, you get a bit nervous when you're landing these days in America. And I put my passport down and I was going to Brown University, and the guy at the customs at the immigration said, "So ma'am, where are you going?" And I said, "No, I'm going to this university." "What are you doing there?" "No, I'm talking about climate change." And then he put his pen down and he looked at me and he said, "Seriously now, surely you can do teleconferences." And I was so taken aback, because that's not the kind of message and impression you get coming from, coming into the States at this time. But anyway, thank you all very, very much. So it's great to be here. I want to set my talk as more of a framing talk, if you like. I'm going to talk about securing water in a changing environment, particularly obviously talking about from where I come from, which is in Southern Africa. And I want to particularly frame my talk around reactions, responses, and what I want to be kind of brave enough to say around reframings. And I'm really glad that we heard about the intersectionality, because I think what I want to try and show is the context of where we're coming from in Southern Africa. Then, as I said, look at some of the reactions that we've had to water issues in those contexts. Then reflect, which I don't think we do a lot of anymore, really, unfortunately, and then reframe. And the intersectionality, I think, is well captured in this diagram, where we're dealing with a can of worms, right? As we heard earlier, if you start poking at that from one direction, other things pop up. And, Rittel and Weber and others have called these the complex wicked challenges. So the science, particularly in which I work, is, got huge amounts of uncertainty. There's complexity, there's interdependency, and there's controversy. But I think it's the controversy that I want to come back to later on as I progress through my talk. So the moment is now here. Some of us have been working in this field for a long, long time. But never before, I think, have we had the intersection of some of these major global programs, major global almost treaties, if you like, urging us to move on this. We've got the Sustainable Development Goals, we've got the Paris Climate Agreement, we've got the Sendai Framework, and we've also got the new urban agenda. And the whole idea is to not leave anyone behind. But the problem is, unfortunately, in how these things get put into place, who takes them up, the power relations in how these things unravel in various contexts, which I'm going to try and focus on as well. But before I continue, I just want to give you my framing, my initial departure point on how I want to talk about water security here this afternoon. And it's not only about acceptable quantity and quality of water, but I also want to use Gray and Sadoff's very neat, I think, conceptualization, which is how water presents a set of risks to people, environment, and economies. So I'm going to try and intersect those two things, and hopefully I can pull it off. So as I indicated earlier, I want to start off with the context. So those of you who come and are familiar with Southern Africa, or any part, if you like, of Africa, will know that we're faced with constant, if you like, almost repeated droughts that keep occurring with fairly regular frequency. And in September 2016, we had an entire summer rainfall drought, and the reason why we're concerned is the area where it occurred, because many of our rainfall systems are triggered by some of the high-lying areas. And so we're worried about these parts of the eastern parts of the country where, if we start having these droughts more regularly and more frequently, it could have issues for mega dam construction. So we keep an eye on that. But it's not only about when times are scarce or in a drought, but equally, as many of you know, we've just had a very severe cyclone that occurred in Mozambique, in Beira, but that's not new, and it's a point I want to challenge later on in my talk as well. Is this the new normal? And I think we need to be interrogating some of these concepts. So here's a picture of when a cyclone occurred in a similar area in Mozambique, only to be followed, as I said, a couple of weeks ago in Mozambique as well, this time Tropical Cyclone Ida. And unfortunately, in this case, because of where it was located and also at an outlet of a major river coming out into the ocean, caused a major damming, as you can see here, and impacted a number of people. I think 200 people's lives were lost, or we're still counting, I think, some of the damage. So the context isn't only about abundance of water, too much or too little, but unfortunately for us in Africa, those of you who've worked on climate in Africa will know this, and I know I have great colleagues sitting in the room who work on the atmospheric sciences of it, and it's because of our configuration in the climate system, where we have high pressures dominating to the north and to the south, that kind of stable environment really doesn't help us when we're having things like climate change. So Africa, according to the IPCC, will be one of the continents that will really heat up because of those configurations, and also may warm up more than twice the global average. So you would think that people in the African continent are taking this really seriously. The other reason of concern is not because we don't know what to do about this, but we are coming off quite a low base relative to other countries who are trying to tackle this problem. So we've got water scarcity, abundance, and then the heat issue. But what's really fascinating, if you're an atmospheric scientist, as I started off in my life, that's not as simple as it is. And we heard about the intersectionality. So just as you start digging into those issues, you can't forget about the famous El Nino. And I'm going to talk about that as well a little bit later. So ocean currents that shift, warm up, and change, and then feed into the big global circulation patterns, and unfortunately descend over parts of Africa, causing, again, some of that heating. So I'm glad we're having drinks later, because if you come from this part of the world, there's not much to really be excited about, because we are, as I said, going to warm up quite a lot. And the prognosis going forward is really not good. You'll see there that based on some of the projected modeling that's going on, we're going to have more frequent droughts, it's projected, more heat waves, reduced soil moisture, longer burning seasons, and so on. So the temperature story is really not great. Equally so, the rainfall story is not as good, and it's hard to get the rainfall right because you're dealing with so many complexities in the rainfall system. But even there, where you look at the science of the projections going forward, it paints a similar picture. So that's the context. The projections are not too good, but so how well have we done if we look back over our shoulder, which we don't often do, I think, and really try and look at how things have panned out for water in this part of the world. So I want to now talk and look at reactions and reflections, particularly from a disaster management context. I hope you can read that. It might be a little bit small, but I was fortunate. I'll take you through it if you can't read it. I was fortunate to be part of a group that was tasked by RIASCO to look at about 10 to 12 years of disaster risk occurrence in Southern Africa. We chose a number of countries, and then we tracked working with people in the different countries, Malawi, Lesotho, Swaziland, and so on. And we tried to look at how the humanitarian story was shaping up in that part of the world and how disasters were panning out. And what you can see here, hopefully, is that there's no lags between the years. So every single year, there was a concatenation of disasters. So there wasn't just a single disaster. So let me just take you through this so that you get some sense. So the pink boxes are representing cholera incidents. Where you see the red and the black, and you might not see the countries' names, but the red indicates when you had international humanitarian assistance, the black when you didn't get any humanitarian assistance. So a lot of complexity occurring all at one time, and co-occurrences of disasters. And I think that's a very important point that I'd like to stress. So when we looked at that range of data that we had, and we really dug into all these complex emergencies, of the set that we had, 47 humanitarian emergencies occurring, 37 of those were linked to environmental threats, and 26 over that span were linked to flood-related disasters, so affecting a large number of people. But there are two interesting things about these disasters. If they were discrete and you didn't have any intersectionality, it'd be kind of not easy to manage, but a little bit easier to manage. But unfortunately, there's these spatial dimensions, particularly when these events are really strong and huge and large, which is what some of the climate projections are suggesting. So in this case, with Cyclone Coleen, it crossed right across the Southern African, from one side of the continent to the other, and it crossed into these different countries, Botswana, Madagascar, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, etc., putting huge pressure onto various systems in the subcontinent. But it's not just a spatial configuration that you have to worry about, it's also temporally over time. And you can see here that some countries, this is for Madagascar, some countries are facing these knocks 2 to 3 times a year. And if you look at, I don't think the pointer works that well, but if you look at the bottom circle, of the 26 or so events that occurred there over the time period that we were investigating, 24 of those were linked to cyclones. So the water issue and those concerns coming through the disaster risk issues are quite serious. But this is an interesting thing that came out of the study. In Malawi, over the time period 2000 to 2012, there were more than 150 disasters of national significance, and less than 10 were given international humanitarian assistance. And so how do these countries bounce back if they're not getting any support? And it's a continuous knocking onto their GDP, onto their economy, onto livelihoods, etc. So some serious concerns with the disaster risk, if you like, dimension of the water-related challenges that we face. But it's not as simple as that. So when you try and now put this together and just take out the climatology of it and look at the social dimensions, there are a whole range of risk drivers. For example, African growth, HIV/AIDS, declining food production, climate change, as well as the hazards which I've been talking about, droughts and floods. And then you've got a couple of resilience builders that people pop into the system to try and make these countries more robust, things like social safety nets. But the concern is that if you're doing the wrong kind of resilience building, you could make these countries even more maladapted and more prone to these kinds of disasters. So we have a huge task. When we sign up to the Sendai framework, it's easy to just sign your name. But if you're actually really wanting to do the integrated and robust science that you need to do in these complex settings, you really need to, put hair on your teeth, actually. That's what it takes to really do it properly. So I want to keep moving on now and just to recap a little bit about what I've just tried to share with you. It's a complex system. We don't just do impacts anymore. The climate event, hitting an exposure unit, whether that's a farm, a business, a town, Beira in Mozambique, and then measure how many people died. That would be tragic enough to do, but it's not enough. What we've now got to try and do is understand what's driving that vulnerability of that exposure unit. Like I showed you, how does HIV connect onto that? How does job insecurity, how does conflict, how does weak governance, all those things impact making that unit very, very vulnerable. So the first take-home message I'd like you to leave with tonight is that we really need to be putting our money where our mouth is in this research and getting at the structural vulnerabilities. What is causing these vulnerabilities, and not only just measuring, which is important in itself, the tracking of the changes over time. So as I end the first part of my talk, we really need to find ways to manage these complex risks. There are many exposures, as I showed you. They occur continuously. Sometimes they're compounded. Sometimes they're coming in 1 year. Multiple vulnerabilities. And unfortunately, no one person or group can do this alone. And we need this cooperative science, which I'm going to talk about right at the end of my talk. So even in terms of the humanitarian assistance, some people are saying that even the humanitarian movement is so busy trying to solve these problems that it's become caught up in its own permanent state of emergency. And some people argue the humanitarian assistance, when it is given, is becoming a business in itself. So we need to critique that as well. But the point that I've highlighted in bold here, the structural dimensions that are producing this vulnerability is critical. So I'd now like to pause and reflect on my own work that I've been doing as a climate scientist. I'm interested not just in the climate system, but also how we frame the question, because I think that's quite critical. So those of you who are social scientists in the room, I think we don't spend enough time thinking about how notions of scarcity and abundance are actually framed, how they're embedded in specific cultural contexts, meanings, beliefs, traditions, how different social actors interpret those notions of scarcity, and then what practices emerge over time. So I'm going to take one slice of work that I did many, many years ago, but I think it still resonates with some of the things that I'm trying to present here tonight. So it's not just the El Niño, it's really an issue that we have to face time and time again in this part of Southern Africa. And you can see this as an index which gives you an idea of how the El Niño is developing over time. And everything above in the red bars shows you when that occurs for us, El Nino, we tend to get drought and dry conditions. But I was fortunate to be wrapped up in a very interesting time, I think, in South Africa. It was just before we got the new regime, if you like, when President Nelson Mandela came into power. But at that time, we had a huge drought that occurred in the region in the early 1990s. And at the time, people were really trying, I think, for some political gain, trying to see what the drought was doing, particularly in terms of the justice dimensions, the developmental context. So where did the drought and development progress in the country intersect? And what ended up happening is that as people were going out into rural areas in South Africa, they noticed that there were pumps that weren't working, areas in the former homelands that hadn't been fully, if you like, developed, farmers without subsidies, the usual kind of tragic story, I think, of many of those of us who work on drought in Africa can attest to. But what was really cool was that they set up a drought forum. It was a collective platform for plural views. We'd never had this ever before. So scientists getting together with NGOs, getting together with churches, getting together with business, forming this huge, massive forum where we debated all of these concerns. So it was actually a wonderful moment in the time of South African history where we had this wonderful development, and actually it paved the way for much of our policy. Many of the people who headed up some of these things, which I'll show you in a minute, became our ministers. So at the time, we had a water supply task force, we had an employment task force, we had an agricultural task force, a nutritional task force. These were serious efforts where a nationwide deliberation and a coming together of people to kind of get a handle on what a drought really meant in the country. We even had a publication, machinery, and as you can see in the front, I don't know if you can see that document, but these things all led into some of the legislation which we now have, which is touted around the world actually as being some of the best in the world on disaster management. But why am I telling you this? Well, the problem is that I think we don't stop to reflect. So if you fast forward to 2014 or 2016, which is the first opening slide that I showed you of drought coming in the more recent years, the knowledge of climate change, I think, has never been stronger. You know, we're really starting to get a good handle on what is happening on climate change. But that forum, that was an open forum, pulling in various political parties, various concerned citizens, civic society, massive initiative, seems to have been forgotten. It's quite interesting. You can pull that whole thing together, and we're quick to forget. So there's little evidence of this more reflexive process that I think is needed. And then, unfortunately, you fast forward right into the present, and I think you've all heard of the current Cape Town crisis. And so I just want to share a little bit of that with you and kind of counterpoint it to the massive effort that happened in the country in the early 1990s, and particularly challenging these notions of new normal and interpretations of scarcity. So the Cape Town story is really interesting. We kind of knew it was coming. It was a drought that lasted for a couple of years. It was in a very, for those of you who aren't familiar with Cape Town, not across the entire province necessarily, but really acutely felt in the actual heartland of the city. About 4 million people, 4.5 million being affected. It wasn't just a drought story, it was also because we had huge demands, abstraction, a growth in population. So again, this coming together of these, if you like, complex drivers. But what was really interesting, we knew that this was starting to happen. So after 1 year, then 2 years, then 3 years, some of the data apparently coming from the weather services in the third year was saying, no, we're going to get a good season. So there was a little bit of controversy amongst the scientists of whose data sets to believe. But it ended up becoming a 4-year drought, one of the worst in over 130 years. And unfortunately, there was delayed decision, Cape Town almost entirely dependent on water from some of the 6 main dams. And just to give you a little bit of a sense, I'm not going to dwell on some of the climatology, but just to show you the comparisons, I don't know if you can see that, but the pink line, how the daily rainfall was operating across time, and then followed by the black line, which is the median, obviously going through that area, and over time declining. And the progressive depletion of storage and demand management as we were going into this drought, as it got worse and worse. So we only towards the end really started to come up with ideas. And again, that for me was quite surprising because we've had droughts before. It's almost unforgivable that we get caught kind of unawares when these things happen. And so it's really interesting the way Cape Town handled this drought, because they started messaging that this drought is the new normal. This is how it's going to be going forward. You guys better get used to this. We're going to have to plan as we go into the new normal of climate change. But what was even more interesting is that we conceptualized this notion of day zero. And some of us are now starting to critique this. Why would you call this day zero? It tended to really mobilize people. So whenever, if you were in Cape Town at the time, you'd be driving along the highway and they'd say things like, day zero is going to occur. So they kept shifting the day zero out over time, trying to get people to cut down on their consumption of water. And eventually day zero, thank goodness, didn't happen because the rain eventually did come. So how was it avoided? And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just suffice it to say we had supply augmentation. The agricultural farmers decided to release some of their water down into the city, and Cape Town's domestic demand actually halved because of, in some cases, a blame and shame thing where you would have an app which would be showing which households were not conserving water. But people were being threatened, well, not threatened, but urged that if they did not cut down their consumption, so 50 liters a day, and in fact, in some cases, people were saying if day zero does occur and the dam levels go down to about 13.5%, you'll then have to drive around to specific points in the city with your buckets and get your water for the day. And many of my friends who live in Cape Town changed their lives completely. They were recycling water, grey water, very, very impressive. So this has started to reshape, if you like, a new normal way of doing things in Cape Town. We're now thinking about water reclamation, about springs, about permanent desalinization, etc. And I think there are similarities perhaps to California and other cases here in the United States. But the domestic response was really impressive. Once the message started to kick in, people really started to cut down on their water demand. But some people have argued that even though Cape Town had some of the best demand-side management programs, it was not really well handled. There was poor crisis management, a loss of trust of the electorate, and it seemed to be that the interventions were way too late. So where am I taking you on this? I want to again come back to reflections of drought really matter. How you frame a drought is critical. The iconic drought, for example, in Australia that occurred roughly at the same time as the 1990s drought that I shared with you earlier, had a similar response. They weren't punitive. There were no fines. They rather used community pressure with huge public forums, getting civic society on board. The Cape Town story, initially, there was no, if you like, integrated community buy-in, and rather the messaging was around this day zero and the new normal. So people are starting to ask how you frame that drought is really critical in terms of the response. So I'd now like to turn, as I come towards the middle, if you like, of my talk, to where I live, the Johannesburg story. We are now watching very carefully what happens in Johannesburg, city almost about the same size, but obviously trying to look what has happened in Cape Town and see what we can do. The Johannesburg story is interesting because we've recently had some major flash floods. In 2016, this is, for those of you who are familiar with Johannesburg, this is just near Alexandra Township area, on the way to the OR International Tambo Airport. A huge downpour. I believe I missed the snow last week. I wanted one of those bombs as well. But unfortunately, this was a flash flood that wasn't such fun. Unfortunately, people lost their lives. The airport was kicked out of action for, I think, 2 days. So it wasn't a great event. But it's, again, what some of the projections are saying, that we're going to go through this. We're going to have these rainfall events. They're going to be becoming more severe, more frequent, of greater magnitude. And the loss, I didn't convert these into dollars, but I think my exchange rate, which isn't great, is 1 to 15. So the loss of life and initial damages around between 70 and 170 million, and we're still not sure if that's what one event cost us. So a huge amount of rain that deluged into Johannesburg and caused quite a lot of damage. So how do we handle this? How do we now, again, we've been doing the science for donkey's years, honestly, really. Some of us have been working on vulnerability assessments for ages. Unfortunately, what's happening is that in the city of Johannesburg itself, we don't seem to have a good sense of where the most vulnerable are. We have some idea, but this kind of caused a real wake-up plan when we realized that we don't have the fine-tuning. So we have a social vulnerability index, but we have no sense of how to overlay on top of that some of the climate data. More recently, some of us have tried to begin to articulate a vulnerability map that would be maybe of more use. And so I don't think you can see some of those dots, unfortunately, but we're starting to put where the commercial activities are, where the mining activities are, and then trying to intersect that onto where some of the major rivers would be flowing, etc. So there's an awakening, and I started to work with the city of Johannesburg 2.5 years ago. And the reason why I say that, it's important because we were co-designing the strategy right from the beginning. I didn't go in with a grant and then ask them to come on as partners. We were trying to do this right from the beginning. So in the community where we had a large number of losses, particularly in the informal settlement area of Alexandra, again, a long struggle history there, a long culture of change, we started to investigate, do these people get early warning messages? How prepared are we if we had another one of these flash flood incidents? And I'm not going to go into it into too much detail, but what was really interesting is that community leaders played some role, news media played some role, but the use of cell phone technology didn't seem to be taken up. So an interesting gap that we found there. But one of the more interesting things was the contradictions. I don't know if you remember in the beginning of my talk, I spoke about some of the contradictions that I think are really the exciting parts of the science. And so when we went into the city, I took a very keen honors student. She was going to look at the heat waves, because when we read the literature, it said that the city really has a plan. When we sat down with the city officials, there was no plan at all, not at all, despite the fact that we've been having quite a number of hot events and heat waves. So we started to probe this in a lot more detail, and here's where I want to raise some of these contradictions. So when we went into the city on the hill, the bureaucratic part of the city, the parts that were familiar with climate change and agreements, etc., said, yes, we definitely need a heat wave plan, we need to be doing something. But on the other hand, on the ground, in the regions where things should be happening, none of the people, in fact, as you see here, most people were saying, there is no plan, we don't have time for this, it's not on our pay checks, it's not our responsibility, and we'll wait until something really kicks in. So these contradictions, I think, about periods of scarcity and heat are something that I would like to probe a lot more. Likewise, and I'm sure it happens here in cities in America, you have engineers who've been trained in one paradigm to deal with stormwater management issues, sustainable urban drainage systems, and then on the other hand, you've got the green ecologist types who are trying to promote ecological services. And again, you've got tensions there. So these water issues are fraught, I think, with areas of contradiction that I think need a lot more investigation. And I'll come to that right at the end of my talk. So going into a city like Johannesburg, the previous mayor was very pro-climate change. The mayor that I've been working under in terms of this work is, I would say, kind of pro-climate change, but not necessarily as, if you like, as responsive as perhaps the previous mayor, although I think he is coming around to it. When we spoke to the different departments, it was really interesting. Again, there's no appetite in a city like Johannesburg, remembering that this is coming at the same time as what's going on in Cape Town. So some of the responses were on the left-hand side of the graph. I don't think you can see it, but they said climate change, it's an elitist discourse. It doesn't really mean anything, except for those of you who've been privileged and those of you wanting papers for publications, etc., etc. There's no long-term vision in the city was the next set of departments that we interviewed. It wasn't on their scorecards. There's no champion, etc., etc. So in terms of what's been happening in the city of Johannesburg, I would argue that we're far away, and I'm sure they're not going to like me saying this perhaps in a public space, but we're only starting to get our act together to actually really start to prepare. And I don't know, I've heard Houston, I've heard just recently in a meeting that I was in Brown last week, similar kinds of situations where you'd think the cities were really geared up, but in fact we aren't. And so what some people are arguing is that we need a much better systems approach, and in most of the cases what is happening is that it's a very siloed approach. Water supply, sanitation, not talking to stormwater, not talking to finances, etc. But we're trying to push this kind of systemic approach in water supply management in Johannesburg, going from a water supply city into a sewage city, into a drain city, into a water cycle city, and to a water sensitive city. So what are some of the lessons as I start to draw my inputs that I've given you tonight just to an end? I think some of the lessons that I'd like to leave you with, perhaps the second take-home message, is that the framing of the situation and the dialogical approaches that we use, drawing out from the actors that you engage with, is really important. It took us 2.5 years to engage with the city, and the business community said, we don't have 2.5 years. You've got to get your climate narrative and your action plans much, much quicker. But unfortunately, I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take time. The sensitive disentangling of different powers and agency and people who have power and control is also a really huge issue that one has to deal with. And finally then, who you bring into that space to help you facilitate and how you do this, and issues of cognitive justice that I showed you with Alexandra, I think, are also key. But it's the next few slides that I really want you to take home, if I may be so bold. So where to next in Africa and water? I mean, I could give you other stories about drought, flooding. I'm sure our colleagues who are going to be on panels will be giving you similar inputs. Is what we have sufficient to transition to this so-called normal, new normal? And is it a new normal? Or is it maybe just the same story that we're just not learning from? We're just not doing our homework. People are talking about we need transformative thinking, we need new institutions, new approaches, etc., etc. So what we've tried to do in this Johannesburg work is to try and be a little bit audacious. And what we did is we used an approach called the Cultural Historical Activity Theory approach, which is called CHAT. And what it does is it helps you to focus on the history of where you're entering into that situation, in this case in the city of Johannesburg. It helps you also to co-create solutions, and then you work through a number of change laboratories which enable you to do what is called an expansive learning process. And I'm not going to go into the details because we don't have a lot of time, and I'm sure we want to open it up for more discussion later. But that's the loop that we try to follow in Johannesburg. So we started questioning, we started raising some of the contradictions in the city, as I've already showed you. We started to analyze the system in order to reveal those inner contradictions. So it wasn't about only getting consensus. That's the point I really would like to stress. Then we started to model some of the functional relationships, go into a new frame that they could use, etc., etc. I would argue that we're literally only about at number 3 after 2.5 years. And that's quite tough because you've got, mayoral elections, you've got people wanting approaches very, very rapidly. But I would argue that doing it slowly in these kind of processes is the only way to go. And then finally, 2 other approaches that I'd like to share with you, and it might sound a bit kumbaya, but I do think we need to think about these because I think we're missing a trick. So in Malaysia, they're starting to use these kind of approaches much more, where you're actually looking at the software, the social system, the hardware, the technical, the engineers that you bring into the room. But then also increasingly this notion of local and tacit knowledge. How do people come to these? Who frames, how are the societies coming to these problems from their local perspectives? And then last but not least, I'm sure you've all heard about transdisciplinarity. It's the big new name in town. We've got to learn together, we've got to co-learn, co-frame, etc., etc. I was a big supporter of this in the beginning of the 2.5 years in Johannesburg, but I've become increasingly more cautious because it is really, if I may use the word damn, it's damn hard to do. It's exceptionally hard to work in this space where supposedly the power is shared. So because I'm a professor, they keep telling me, don't do this, don't keep telling us to come to these meetings. You're the professor, tell us what to do. And I wasn't wanting to do that, right? I wanted us to co-learn, because I didn't know anything about the city. So I think we need to be really interrogating this, and I know some of my colleagues sitting in the room, like Kathy and Robin Reed and others, have been starting to unpack this in other areas of Africa, and we really need to start criticizing that more than just kind of swallowing it as the only way to do it. So ladies and gentlemen, as I end my talk, I've tried to present to you different cases of what water means in the part of the world where I come from a disaster perspective, what it looks like. We're going to have more of those according to the models. I've tried to show you how drought has played itself out, the history of it, because I'm very concerned that we're not looking back in the rearview mirror. We're only looking always forward. And I think we make mistakes by not reflecting on the past. I've tried to show you Johannesburg, the complex political, socio-economic conditions that we're working in. And then finally, I've tried to give you a couple of innovative approaches. But I really do think we need audacious thinking. And I'd like to quote from a paper by a woman working from Amsterdam, Maria Kijker, who's written one of the most brilliant papers I think I've read in this field. And I've been working in this field for a long time. The paper was, "Do not call me resilient again. Just do not do it." So instead of trying to build consensus over the SDGs amongst the usual suspects, the invited participants, imagine focusing on monitoring dissensus instead. So in a way, I kind of was trying to do that in the city of Johannesburg. Not the consensus, but why isn't heat being taken up? Getting to the dissensus. Imagine focusing on where, how, why, and by whom conflict and disagreement are generated. I think if we talk to the university senior people here, they'll say, oh, yeah. We need to be working perhaps on dissensus and maybe not on consensus. Imagine no longer ignoring the new research and policy questions that emerging practices of dissensus raise. And then finally, she has this brilliant quote from a lady called Tracy Washington, who after the floods in New Orleans got so frustrated with people saying, no, we're going to help you be resilient. And she got up in a platform and said, every time you say, oh, they're resilient, it actually means you can do something else, something new to my community. We were not born to be resilient. We are conditioned to be resilient. And I don't want to be resilient. I want to fix the things that create the need for us to be resilient in the first place. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I really think I'm coming back to my initial statement where I said that structural vulnerability, if we are not going to get to that, if we're just going to go around doing, we need everyone to bounce back, how can I go to a place like Malawi, who's experiencing 150 events in a period of 12 years and say, no, we'll make you resilient, we'll make you robust? How do I go to Johannesburg where floods like that occurred, where on an everyday basis, not just when a big event occurs, they are living in conditions that are not fantastic? So I'd like to end by saying we were not born to be resilient in Africa. We are conditioned. But I think in that conditioning, we can share a lot with the rest of the world about how to navigate water in Africa. Thank you very much.